Now that my master is taking the position away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig, and I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do so that when I am dismissed as a manager, people may welcome me into their houses. So, summoning his master's debtors one by one, he asked first, how much do you owe my master? He answered, 100 jugs of olive oil. He said to him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 50. Then he asked another, how much do you owe? He replied, 100 containers of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and make it 80. And his master commended the dishonest manager because he had acted shrewdly. For the children of this age are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than are the children of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of dishonest wealth, so that when it is gone, they may welcome you into the eternal homes. Whoever is faithful in a very little is faithful also in much. And whoever is dishonest in a very little is dishonest also in much. If then you have not been faithful with the dishonest wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you have not been faithful with what belongs to another, who will give you what is your own? No slave can serve two masters, for a slave will either hate the one and love the other, or be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth. The word of the Lord. When you first hear that story that Jesus tells about a manager accused of dishonesty, you start to scratch your head. This man wasted his master's possessions. He's about to get fired. And he scrambles to save himself from being left out in the cold. And his plan to do that is not so noble. He cooks the books, reducing the debts of his master's clients so that they will welcome him when he becomes unemployed. And then, and a really surprising twist, Jesus says that the master praises the man, not for his integrity, not for his righteousness, but for being shrewd. Why would Jesus use this as an example? Why would he commend anything about that person? Shouldn't this dishonest manager serve more as a cautionary tale and not a role model? And yet, in the strange way that parables often work, Jesus unsettles us. He unsettles our sense of who the hero is and what the lessons are to be learned. That's part of how he teaches. This story disorients us so that we can reorient it in the direction of God's kingdom. To a first century audience, the people who heard this, the story would have been just as shocking as it is to you and me. Most people listening to Jesus would have had little sympathy for the wealthy landowner. Here was an absentee owner, far removed from the lives of the ordinary people. They would have had little sympathy for the manager, who was a middleman, exploiting laborers on behalf of the landowner. So, when the manager gets into trouble, the listeners would feel no pity. They might perk up when he devises, I know I can get that word out, devises a clever way to save himself by reducing the debt of the tenants and the sharecroppers that owed money to the master. So those listening suddenly, who themselves were most likely struggling under the burden of debt, see some hope. Whatever the man's motives, the result is that ordinary people are given some relief. Maybe this is why the master himself can't help but admire his manager's quick thinking. It's not that his dishonesty is celebrated, but his resourcefulness is. And Jesus takes the moment and says, look how much energy people can come up with when their future is on the line. And this is where the lesson digs in. The dishonest manager poured all his creativity, urgency, and strategy into protecting himself from poverty. He adjusted accounts. He took some big risks, all for his survival. And Jesus says, seems to say, what if my followers showed half that energy when it came to the things of God? It's as though Jesus is pointing out the irony. People will work tirelessly for their own gain, even using questionable methods. But how little energy they sometimes give for the purposes of God's kingdom. They'll pour themselves into careers, into investments, their reputation, their possessions. But they hesitate to be imaginative about things like generosity and service, faithfulness. Jesus doesn't excuse the dishonesty, but he exposes how misplaced human efforts often are. If people can be that creative in serving themselves, shouldn't the children of light be just as creative in serving God? So the story teaches also about urgency. The manager knew he had very little time before he was about to get sacked. So he acted quickly. He didn't linger. He didn't just sit around hoping circumstances might change. He didn't waste time on excuses. He understood the seriousness of the situation, and he responded decisively. So much of faith falters, not because people lack belief, but because they lack urgency. We think we have endless tomorrows to mend relationships, to forgive others, to become more generous, to deepen our prayer lives. But Jesus tells us this story as if to say, time is short, so you better act now. There was a guy once who was a church treasurer. He was a kind and faithful man. His career had been in investment banking. He would spend hours devising strategies to maximize the profits for his clients. Every loophole was explored. Every financial instrument was examined. It was his job to make sure that that money worked as hard as possible for those who had it. But one Sunday, sitting in church, he realized how little he thought about what his own money might accomplish for God's purposes. He realized that he had invested his ingenuity into helping wealth grow, but he had really done very little to help the gospel grow. And that, for him, was a turning point. He didn't stop being in finance, but he started bringing that same diligence to thinking about how his resources, time, skills, money, would serve Christ. He said, if I could give that much imagination to increasing a portfolio, surely I can give as much to increasing compassion. That's the sort of conversion that Jesus is talking about in this parable. Not dishonesty, but redirected ingenuity. The parable also causes us to consider stewardship. The dishonest manager never owned the wealth that he manipulated. It belonged to the master. And isn't that true for all of us? All that we have, our time, our talents, our possessions, our opportunities, they're ultimately God's. We're not the owners, we're the stewards. The story confronts us then with the question, how are we doing managing what God has placed in our care? Are we using it for narrow self-interest? Or are we using it in ways that reflects God's priorities of mercy, justice, generosity? St. Augustine not St. Augustine the city, St. Augustine the theologian, once commented that wealth is not truly ours, but is entrusted to us for the sake of others. He said that when we give, we are not being especially charitable. We are simply returning to God's purposes what was never fully ours to keep. That insight fits this parable really well. The manager's mistake was to treat what belonged to another as if it was his own. But Jesus turns that mistake into a lesson. Remember that your life and your resources belong to God, so handle them accordingly. Jesus closes the teaching with a sobering reminder. No one can serve two masters. The dishonest manager tried to serve himself, and in the end was found out. We too face the constant tug of competing loyalties. Will we serve wealth, status, comfort, or will we serve God? Serving God does not mean neglecting our responsibilities or pretending that money doesn't matter. It means keeping money and possessions in their proper place as tools, not as masters. It's not asking, how much can I keep? But how can I use what I have in ways that reflect God's heart? So perhaps that strange commendation in this parable makes more sense now. Jesus is not approving of dishonesty, but he does lift up resourcefulness, urgency, and shrewdness as qualities that could be redirected towards God's kingdom. If only the people of light would be as imaginative as the people worried about self-preservation. To sum it up, the parable of the dishonest manager bothers us because it doesn't follow the expected moral script. But in the surprise, we hear Jesus' challenge. 1, be as creative in faith as others are in self-interest. 2, be as urgent in living for God as others are in securing their own future. And 3, be as faithful in stewardship as others are in protecting their wealth. Even if a dishonest man could be praised for his shrewdness, how much more will God be pleased when we use our energy, imagination, and resources for the sake of love, peace, and mercy? That is the surprising condemnation Jesus hopes we will seek, not from a worldly master, but a commendation from our heavenly Lord. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit.